All right, welcome everyone to this session around taper nutrition. Obviously, a lot of people have got races coming up. Just looking through the app the other day, there's a lot of people racing over the next couple of weekends, and obviously throughout the rest of the next couple of months. So this session is going to be about, I guess, what you do during that taper phase in that last couple of weeks leading up to a race. What's important, what you don't need to worry about. I guess there's a few sort of myths and misconceptions around tapering as well from a nutrition perspective, and I guess how the app fits into that, and a couple of settings that are important to make sure you've got right in the app as part of that tapering process. So what we're going to have a look at, I guess, is firstly how training changes during a race taper, and I guess what the implications of that are from a nutrition perspective. I guess looking specifically at what are we actually trying to achieve from a nutrition perspective during that tapering phase. How is this reflected in the Fuelin app? And as I said, a couple of settings just to make sure you've got those set up properly in the back end of the app as well. And as I said, some things to not do during tapering, because I think sometimes people try and cram in a few last minute things from a nutrition point of view, or start preparing for race days well and truly before they actually need to start preparing as well. So we'll kind of bust a few myths around that along the way. Okay, so I think everyone here on the call will be familiar with who we are. So Elizabeth, Scott, and myself. But obviously for those who are watching who might not be familiar, we're all involved with Fuelin and work with some of the individual athletes and help answer and run these Q&A sessions. So if we look at, I guess, that tapering period prior to a race, I guess there's a few questions we need to think about. I guess the first thing I'd start off with here is we kind of think of a taper as this generic kind of thing, but everyone does tapering differently. Different coaches have different theories and methods of how they do tapering. They might even individualize that to athletes. Different athletes within a group might even do slightly different tapering for maybe the experienced coaches who've worked with athletes for a long period of time and had feedback on what has or hasn't worked from previous races, that sort of thing as well. But I guess if we look at it in sort of generic terms, a taper is basically a reduction in the training frequency and or duration typically. So it's doing less training, I guess, in those lead up period to a race. Usually you retain the intensity of training. So it's doing less training, but still doing intensity in training to stay sharp for race day. Now, again, it varies a lot in terms of, how long people taper for. Typically, I guess the classic tapering is about 2 weeks prior to race day is when that starts to happen. And that usually follows a big training block, a build block in training, and then you go through this block of tapering into a race. So why does this happen? Well, I guess the key thing is performance kind of has two parts to it. There's the fitness component and then there's the fatigue component. And you're kind of pushing and pulling between those two all the time. And so coming off a big block of training, yes, you'll have fitness, but you'll also have fatigue there. So the idea with the taper is by backing off the training volume, reducing that fatigue, but retaining the fitness by including that high intensity stuff still in there, just to a smaller volume. So the idea is that you arrive on race day in optimal fitness, but with minimal fatigue, so you can perform at your best on race day. Now, there are examples where someone might go into a race with very little tapering, and that can be for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of pro athletes, for example, who race quite a lot throughout the year, and this is probably more short course racing, they may go into some events actually not tapering at all because that particular event is not their most important event. It's more there as part of training or experience, or because they have to show up to get points, but the actual result isn't the be all and end all, or they're going to a domestic race where the field isn't particularly strong, and so they don't really need to absolutely optimize their performance to get the result that they need. And some of the pro guys and the para guys that I work with, they've gone into races without tapers and they hate it because they feel terrible, and they obviously don't perform as well as they possibly could. But sometimes there are reasons why coaches choose not to taper someone into an event. But for long course racing, obviously you don't race as frequently. And so generally speaking, there usually will be a taper unless there's some specific reason not to. Okay, so let's have a look at the nutrition aspect around tapering. And I guess the first thing I'd say here is that nutrition really is designed to complement the training. So if the training is changing, then the nutrition is going to change as well. So what are we trying to do during this period? Well, we're trying to still fuel the sessions that you do have. So obviously you're doing sessions typically that are shorter, maybe longer breaks between those sessions, but they're often of relatively high intensity. And so you still need the fuel for those sessions, but you might not have to be fueling as aggressively as frequently, or recovering as aggressively between sessions because they're sort of spaced out a little bit more. I guess the other thing is, from an overall nutrition point of view, is that some people are very conscious of avoiding over fueling the smaller training volume. So if you're backed off the training in that last couple of weeks, people are often very conscious of, I don't want to overeat and end up, gaining body fat in that last couple of weeks of tapering because I'm exercising less. I don't want to be eating the same. So that's something that we do need to consider. The other thing we obviously want to consider is this is the period where we're trying to reduce fatigue. And so optimizing recovery, not so much from the refueling point of view, because there's less to refuel for, but particularly in terms of that repair element from a protein perspective is going to be important because we're trying to freshen up during a taper. The other thing that we do see sometimes for people during that taper phase, because they've come off a big block of training, this is one of those times, and then when that training suddenly reduces, where they might be at actually increased risk of illness. And you often see the athlete that gets sick in that week or two before a race. Very frustrating, obviously, because it can affect, obviously, race day performance. Very stressful for people as well. But you do see it happening. So from a nutrition point of view, it is important that we don't really try and undercut things too much during this period for fear of fat gain, and then end up getting sick as a result of that. And then I guess the final thing towards the end of the taper is actually preparing for that sort of pre-race, those last couple of days prior to the race. So I'm not going to talk today about those last couple of days prior to the race because we're doing a session around that in a couple of weeks' time. But I guess this might be a time in that taper where you might be doing any kind of last-minute practice of a race nutrition plan, whether that's, picking up bottles on the go, whether that's, certain types of gels or how you pack things around your bike, whatever it is. And then also the other thing I think that's sometimes underrated is that often you're traveling for a race. And again, we do a separate session around travel in this Q&A series, but sorting out that pre-race accommodation and food will be during that taper phase. So if you arrive at your accommodation 3 or 4 or 5 days prior to an event, sometimes even longer, it's setting up, getting that set up right. So, you've got the ability to prepare and consume the foods that you want, particularly when it comes to the carb loading in that last couple of days before a race as well. Okay, now the good thing from a fueling point of view here, as I said, the training is going to reduce, and so the nutrition, particularly the carbohydrate, is going to reduce with that. And I guess the key thing here is that Fuelin is going to do that for you automatically. And I've just pulled out an example here of someone who's racing at the end of this week. And I couldn't fit it all on the page so you could see it, but to the left there, which is cut off, was June. And you would have seen in there that almost all of those dots throughout the calendar were green with a couple of yellow days mixed in between there. So that was kind of that big build phase, which I've kind of surrounded in the red line there. And so they were, much higher in carbohydrate sort of day to day because of the training load during that time. But you can see the section from the 7th of July through to the 20th, that's the taper phase. And you can see it quite clearly that the color changes almost immediately during that phase. So from, predominantly green to predominantly yellow in this particular case. And again, that'll obviously be different for every athlete. But you can see quite clearly, if you were to have a guess at what's happening in that training, you would assume that the training volume has backed off quite significantly, and therefore the carbs have backed off, hence why it's gone from green to yellow during that phase. And then you've got the 21st and the 22nd, they're obviously the carb loading days, which I've surrounded with the purple box. So again, back to very high carbohydrate those last 2 days before the race. And then the 23rd in this case was race day. So essentially, from a taper point of view, as long as your coach has programmed in the sessions into Training Peaks or today's plan, Final Surge, whichever system that you use, Fuelin should take care of the adjustment of that from a carbohydrate point of view and making sure you're not over, but also under fueling during that period. And I guess on that note, a couple of things to bear in mind with Fuelin in terms of your app settings during taper. And I've got the examples there over on the left. So I'm hoping that everyone knows how to get to this screen in their app. So when you're in the app, you've got the menu along the bottom, the far right one of the menu bar at the bottom, and then you click on the edit next to your name and you'll come into this page here. And I guess the key things here is we want the primary purpose set to performance and the training focus set to in season, because this is a period where, yes, we need less carbohydrate because we're training less, but at the same time, we don't want to be dramatically under fueling during this period because we want to be optimizing those sessions that we do have, and we want to be recovering as well as we can, and we don't want to get sick in that last couple of weeks coming off a big block of training. So make sure that that's set to performance, make sure that's set to in season, and it's been chopped off the bottom here. But in terms of weight goals, make sure your goal weight is set to the same as your current weight, so it's not putting you into a calorie deficit during this period as well. So if you just tweak those 3 settings heading into your taper, that should optimize things from a planning point of view within the app.
And Alan, I'll just something for athletes to know is in that final week before the race, as long as the race is input, and I'm not sure if you're covering that, I'll certainly be covering that in my talk about how to make sure that races are created correctly in their training platform. But in that last week, the athlete is automatically put into what we call a maintenance phase anyway, just in case they forget to put their goal weight to their current weight. But certainly it's something that we do talk about with a lot of athletes who either through consultations or if they're in that sort of one-to-one or co-pilot, is making sure that you're not trying to be losing weight in those, weeks leading into the race. Just accept where you are. What your weight is at that point in time is going to be fine. And then focus on exactly what Alan's saying is, feeling good, fueling correctly for what the training is going to be, which is probably fairly intense training.
Yep. Cool. All right. So nice segue, Scott, because this is what not to do when tapering. So I put 4 things in here. The first one, and I think this is the one that people are very tempted to do a lot of the time, is that last minute weight loss. Oh, I haven't quite hit that goal that I set out, 12 weeks ago, 20 weeks ago, that I wanted to be at this particular weight for race day. And so I'm just going to kind of try and cram that in these last 2 weeks. All as that's going to do is mean that you're not recovering from those sessions that you are doing. And so when we talk about, high fitness, low fatigue, what's going to happen is you're not going to lower that fatigue properly, and you're going to come in underdone into that race and not optimize performance on race day. So yes, you might be a couple of pounds lighter, but you're probably going to be maybe 15 or 20 watts. You're going to leave 15 or 20 watts on the table on the bike, or, a couple of Ks an hour, or minutes per K, minutes per mile on the run or something like that. So, yes, you can do that, but ultimately it's probably going to do you a disservice on race day. And as I said, there is a genuine risk, and I've seen it quite a lot of athletes getting sick in this last couple of weeks. And again, going on some crash diet to try and lose that last couple of pounds is only going to increase that risk of getting sick in that last week or so before a race. Number 2, over fueling the training volume. So yes, you can obviously underdo things, but you do need to appreciate that you are training less, so you probably don't need to eat quite as much as well. Again, you don't want to undereat, but you don't want to potentially overeat during this period. But again, if you've got things set up properly in the app should guide you to where you need to get to from that perspective. Thirdly, underfueling the training that you do have. So if you're someone who tends to sort of skimp on carbohydrate in particular during training sessions as a general rule, that's only going to have an effect similar to that during this last little period. And when you're trying to get the most out of those limited number of sessions that you do have, again, underfueling training there is going to do you a disservice. And then the final thing is, some people get to the last 2 weeks before a race and go, right, it's time to start looking at my race day nutrition. Well, you've left it way too late at this stage. You really shouldn't be changing anything from a race nutrition perspective in this last couple of weeks. You should have had that plan dialed in weeks ago, ready to go. And you might do a final sort of run through and practice of that just to confirm things. But really, you shouldn't be trying to start something new at this stage from that perspective, or changing what you're doing unless there's a specific issue that's come up that you haven't seen before until now. But ideally, 2 weeks out from a race, your race nutrition should be well and truly dialed in, and you're just doing a bit of a practice sort of dress rehearsal, so to speak. The final thing I'd add here, which I'd forgotten to put on the slide, but I think is really important as well, is if you are traveling for a race, particularly if you're traveling overseas and maybe to a country where there is a risk of food poisoning and hygiene type issues are apparent. One of the other things that we often say to people is, don't go out there and try the local culture and the local cuisine in the week or two before race day. Wait until after the race to try that, because the last thing you want to do is get a case of food poisoning 4 or 5 days before your race that you spent all this time, all this money preparing for, traveled potentially halfway around the world for, and then you've come undone because you decided to go to the local whatever restaurant, eating some food that you're not confident about, or isn't great from a food safety point of view, and you get food poisoning there as well. Wait, you can do that, but wait till after the race is over. All right, now some common myths around tapering. These are things that I see quite a lot, and things that we can probably debunk here, and so you don't need to stress or spend all this time doing all of these things that are probably actually not going to help you from a tapering point of view. The first one is, you do get some people, and I did a survey of this as part of my PhD looking at sodium and hydration practices, that actually start loading up on electrolytes a week prior to race day, or fluid potentially as well, trying to optimize hydration for race day. But the reality is your kidneys are way too smart for that. There's no way you can hack your body into retaining all that fluid and all those electrolytes for 7 days prior to a race. At best, you can probably do that for about 4 to 8 hours maybe. And so you don't need to be loading up on fluid and electrolytes 7 days out from a race. That's really just the last day that you need to focus on that. Unless, you're severely dehydrated for some reason. It's a really hot environment and you've, for some reason, done a big training session, or you've been out all day and haven't had access to water or something like that. The other one, which again was very common maybe 30 or 40 years ago, and some people still hang on to this today, is going on a low carb diet 4 or 5 days out from a race to try and maximize carb loading. So this was something that was done back in the 1980s, particularly with the marathon runners, where they would go on a really low carb diet for 3 or 4 days and then do their carb load. And the idea was that you would get a better effect from the carb loading, having done a low carb diet and completely depleting prior to that. But as I said here, this is sort of left behind by most people in the 1980s for a good reason. And that's because athletes felt absolutely terrible when they did it. And you talk to some of the marathon runners from back in that era, and they say, well, I was okay on race day, but I went through absolute hell to get there, and I would never recommend it. And we know now from research that it's unnecessary, and very few, if any, athletes, certainly at the elite and professional level, do that anymore. Then the final one is, carbohydrate loading. Again, the evidence now probably suggests that a day or two is well and truly enough to do your carbohydrate load to maximize those stores of glycogen, the carbohydrate that we store in our muscles and in our liver, assuming that we're not doing, big amounts of training in those couple of days prior. So you don't really need to do anything out of the ordinary up until that last couple of days from a carbohydrate point of view either.
Yeah, and Alan, on that, I guess the assumption from the Fuelin app and the way we program that, just for athletes to know, is that certainly the 24 hours prior, you will be loaded with around 8 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates. The day 48 hours earlier, it's around 6 to 7 grams. So it's not a full load. It's around 6 grams per kilo body weight. But if training is very high during, if you feel like training volume is higher and that, then it would certainly be something to discuss with either Alan, Elizabeth, or myself prior to that week, and then potentially manually override that. But it would be like a discussion and a consultation to really, individualize that to make sure that it is appropriate to what your coach or yourself has set out in your training week, in your taper week.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think certainly with tapering, how coaches program the taper from a training point of view, which will ultimately dictate what you need to do from a nutrition point of view, is very different from one coach to the next. And I think it's still very much art rather than science in terms of tapering.
Yeah. And same with that, your second point about the low carb diet. So in that last week for the athletes on the program, you will be put into what we call a maintenance phase. So you certainly will have plenty of carbs. It's not a 7-day carb load, but you won't be low on carbohydrates going into that final week as well.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So short and sweet, but just to put all of this together and summarize, firstly, fuel for the training that you're actually doing during the taper. As I said, that is going to be different for everyone because every coach does it a little bit differently. And they may even individualize it based on experience within individual athletes. So as long as you've got your training correctly programmed in and that's reflected in Fuelin, then the Fuelin app should take care of that from a nutrition point of view. So you shouldn't really have to think too much about that or go, start to second guess what you're doing, because the app will guide you from that perspective. As I said, this is not a time to focus on weight loss or cramming in any last minute weight loss. That's probably more likely to compromise your performance more than the couple of pounds might help your performance. It's not a time to try something new from a race day perspective or from a local food perspective, as I said, if you're traveling. There's no need to load up on fluid and electrolytes up until maybe that day before. And even then, we'll talk about that obviously with the other session, whether that's necessary. It's horses for courses. We did the hydration session around sort of pre-race a few weeks ago, so you can go back and have a listen to that as well. And then finally, the carb loading doesn't really need to start until the last 2 days before the race. So again, you don't have to do anything out of the ordinary from that perspective. But again, the Fuelin app will guide you with that as well. All right, that's it for me today. Short and sweet, but hopefully that covers all the key points.
So, Alan, if you stop sharing that, I've got a couple of questions for you. So first one, in terms of the electrolytes, obviously you talked about not overdoing the fluids and electrolytes in sort of the week leading up and that. What about, we get quite a lot of athletes asking about, say, doing a sodium preload, maybe on, again, when they're doing their carbohydrate load, and we've talked about using maltodextrin as a liquid to get some of those carbs in. What about like taking in, say, I certainly hear a lot about like 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter or 1,500 milligrams in a liter or 2 liters 24 hours before. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago about pre-exercise hyperhydration, so actually trying to retain more fluid than your body would naturally be inclined to do, and certainly adding electrolytes will allow you to do that. You can achieve that in as little as 4 hours pre-race. You don't have to do that over 24 hours beforehand. You can, but there's just really no advantage in doing that. Once you get much beyond 24 hours, you're probably actually not going to achieve very much by doing that, because your kidneys are designed to even out all the lumps and bumps in both fluid and electrolyte intakes and losses, and get you back to kind of neutral in terms of euhydration. So yeah, certainly if you overdo it, it's not going to be harmful at all, but the body's likely to just sort it out and not put up with your feeble attempt to try and trick it.
And I guess one thing, like if you can do it for 4 hours before the race, but given race morning can be a little bit stressful for athletes, would you therefore say actually the day before when you're doing your carb load, it could be just as easy to take in some of that extra sodium and fluid, and therefore 24 hours in advance would be logical?
Yeah, you can.
Practical.
Again, how much of that you ultimately end up retaining versus what the kidneys are going to get rid of is hard to say. There's not a lot of research in that kind of time period. But yeah, it's certainly, as I said, it won't be harmful. I guess the only thing that you do see sometimes for athletes is they overdo that and then they end up and down to the toilet all night and get a terrible night's sleep before the race. So that is the risk that you run by doing that too aggressively or trying to do that too aggressively.
Okay. Yep. And then on the morning of the race, if you were trying to, load up on some sodium, like you discussed, sort of in that sort of, what do we say, 2 2 to 3 liters of fluid, depending on the athlete. And
Well, that's the hyperhydration. Yeah.
yeah, if you were
And as I
trying to
said,
hyperhydrate, but if it's
and as I said,
necessary.
like for a lot of those, it's probably more short course racing where that might have a beneficial effect in very hot environments in elite athletes.
Yeah.
Long course racing, personally, I don't think there's a massive need for hyperhydration. It's just about being, you hydrated, well hydrated, basically.
Yeah, no, perfect. And then something that didn't touch on, but I'm sure a lot of athletes are interested, fiber intake, and when, if they should start reducing it, and when they should start reducing it around that taper week or that race week.
Yeah. Again, we don't have a lot of research to say this is the time that you should. I think probably 2 to maybe 3 days. I generally tend to incorporate that as part of the carb loading and not worry about it until that point. I guess the risk again is if you try and go too low too early, is you end up constipated and with GI issues heading into that carb load, which is not very pleasant.
Yeah, and I think that's just sound advice, and that tends to be how we manage it in the app. Is the athlete will see minimize. It's pretty much minimize vegetable intake. You're taking in white, inverted commas, white foods, processed and ultra processed foods to give you maximum calories, maximum carbohydrates with minimum fiber in that 24 to 48 hours beforehand. And I agree. I don't like athletes. There are going to be individual athletes who do want to reduce fiber intake from Monday onwards based on just the way they are. But I think on the whole, I think retaining some vegetable intake and fruits and things like that in certainly Monday to Wednesday makes sense for me. Cool. Right. I don't have any other questions based on that. Anyone else on the call? Does anyone have any questions? I haven't checked the chat. Does anyone have any questions for Alan? Feel free. This is your opportunity, especially if you've got a race at the moment. Everyone's very quiet. Well, if you don't have a question, then we can certainly end the session there, because we won't talk endlessly. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that. If no one's got any questions, we will sign off. Thank you, Alan, for that. I always, I think race week, it can be quite nerve-wracking for a lot of athletes, and I think just dialing it in, and I think your simple messages to, a lot of it is about not doing things, not changing it up, and just keeping it, very simple and very routine orientated, which is, the whole premise of what we do with Fuelin.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I think people tend to overcomplicate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So look, if you can fill in the questionnaire at the end of the session, just give us some feedback on the session and what you want to hear more about. Next week is travel tips by Elizabeth on how to manage racing. And then after that, I will be doing the carbohydrate load and going into the details around that. So, cool. Excellent. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.